The fog in Humboldt Redwoods State Park was so thick it could have been spun from memory itself. Jessica's old Jeep groaned as she steered it along the winding park road, headlights barely slicing through the silvery haze. It was late, nearly midnight, and the world outside her window seemed to hold its breath. The ancient redwoods towered overhead, their dark trunks lost in the mist. Now and then, an owl's cry cut through the hush, answered only by the low rush of wind in the treetops. Jessica let out a long, weary breath, flexing her fingers on the wheel. The day had been endless. Missing hikers, a lost dog, an angry camper convinced that raccoons had sabotaged his tent. She was the only ranger on duty tonight, and her muscles ached with fatigue. Still, she relished the quiet that came after the chaos. The way the park seemed to belong to her alone, or almost alone. Rounding a bend, her foot pressed gently on the gas, then slammed hard on the brake. The Jeep skidded, tires crunching on gravel. There, in the middle of the road, stood a horse. Jessica's pulse hammered in her throat. For a split second, she thought she was seeing things. A huge brown horse, muddy and wild-eyed, its breath puffing in the chill air. Its coat shone dully in her headlights, but what struck her were its eyes, dark, haunted, fixed on her with a sorrow so raw it felt like a plea. She blinked, heart racing. The horse didn't flinch, didn't rear or bolt. It stood rooted, one massive hoof stomping the ground, sending up a spray of mud. Its sides heaved, nostrils flaring as it let out a hoarse, desperate whinny. For a moment, Jessica's childhood rose up in her mind. Her father's steady hands on the reins, the smell of saddle leather, the long afternoons spent brushing down old Pete after her dad came back from another of his silent moods. She shook herself, hand reaching instinctively for the radio. Animal control, her training whispered. Call for backup, wait it out. But another part of her, the part that had learned to listen, really listen, to the unspoken, froze. This horse needed help. Not tomorrow, not after paperwork, but now. Jessica eased open her door, boots hitting the damp ground. The cold wrapped around her, the fog curling like ghosts at her ankles. She kept her voice low, soothing. Easy, big guy. I'm not gonna hurt you. The horse's ears flicked, its gaze never leaving her. Then, in one swift motion, it tossed its head toward the dark tangle of trees beside the road. Jessica caught her breath. Was there something out there? The animal let out another, almost guttural cry, then looked back at her, pleading. Something in those eyes, grief, urgency, pain, made her step forward. She flicked her flashlight on, the narrow beam quivering in her grip. The horse limped back a step, then stopped, watching her, its entire body tense and quivering. Jessica hesitated. Every protocol screamed at her to wait, but she couldn't turn away. She'd spent her life ignoring warning signs, and the cost had always been regret. A sharp gust rattled the branches overhead, sending mist swirling. The horse gave a low, urgent snort, then turned again to the trees, glancing over its shoulder as if to say, "Well, are you coming?" Jessica stood at the edge of the road, one foot on asphalt, the other sinking into the wet moss beside it. She could call animal control, report the sighting, and drive home to her silent, empty cabin. Or she could trust her gut, step off the path, and follow this wild, broken creature into the unknown. She took a breath, remembering the way her father used to look at her after a nightmare. Steady, kind, always leaving the door open for her to decide. She nodded, almost to herself. "Okay, big guy," she whispered. "Let's see what you're trying to show me." As Jessica stepped into the trees, the night swallowed her up, fog thickening until the world became nothing but the thud of her boots, the wet slap of branches against her jacket, and the sound of the horse, limping but determined, leading her deeper into the heart of the forest. Her mind raced. Who would leave a horse out here alone and hurt? And what could have carved such pain into its eyes? Each step seemed to drag her further from the safety of the road, deeper into a story whose ending she could not see. But she couldn't stop. Not now. The horse pressed on ahead, pausing every few yards to look back, checking to make sure she was still there. Jessica's flashlight beam bounced from tree trunk to tree trunk, catching glimpses of tangled underbrush and the ghostly flicker of movement just ahead. Suddenly, the horse halted, muscles quivering, head high and ears pricked. Jessica nearly walked into its haunches. She reached out, laying a tentative hand on its muddy flank, feeling the tremble beneath the hide. "It's all right," she murmured. "I'm here." Somewhere out in the darkness, something moved. A whimper. A muffled cry. The horse let out a sharp, anxious snort, pawing at the ground. Jessica's heart hammered. Was there someone else out here? An injured animal? She pushed forward, forcing herself to move, to trust. As the mist thickened and the night pressed close, Jessica realized she'd left behind the road, the rules, and the safety of what she knew. She was following a wild horse into the unknown, driven by nothing more than the haunted plea in its eyes, and somewhere in the woods, an answer waited, a secret bound up in pain, sorrow, and the hope that even the lost could find their way home. Jessica's breath curled in the fog as she followed the horse into the redwoods, each step drawing her deeper into the unknown. The world narrowed to the rhythmic thud of her boots on sodden earth and the persistent limping stride of the brown horse ahead. Jessica had started thinking of him as he, was a living shadow among shadows, mane damp, sides flecked with mud, eyes flicking constantly between her and the darkness beyond. Branches snagged at her uniform. Moss dripped from ancient boughs above, water pattering softly on her shoulders. Once she stumbled over a fallen limb, her flashlight beam jerking wildly across the undergrowth. The horse paused, waiting, and Jessica felt a strange, protective sense radiating from him. Not wild anger, not the skittishness she'd expected, but a deep, old sorrow and a purpose she couldn't quite name. He led her into a hollow where the fog pooled even thicker. The silence was near total, broken only by the distant hoot of an owl and the soft crunch of leaves beneath hooves. Jessica's nerves danced with every noise. She gripped the flashlight tighter, the memory of her father's voice echoing in her mind. "Never ignore a horse's instincts, Jess. They sense things we never will." Suddenly, the brown horse stopped. His body tensed, nostrils flared, and he tossed his head toward a dense thicket. Jessica's heart leapt. There, tangled in a patch of wire hidden by brambles, was a small, terrified pony. Mud streaked its coat. Its sides heaved with panic. The pony's eyes, wide, rolling with fear, locked onto Jessica, its entire body rigid with pain. Jessica crouched low, heart pounding, and murmured softly, "Hey, it's all right. I'm here." She set her flashlight on the ground, aiming the beam to see the pony's wounds. Blood matted the animal's fetlock where the wire had bitten deep. Its legs quivered, breath coming in shallow bursts. The brown horse, Jessica would call him Ranger, the word coming unbidden to her mind, snorted anxiously, circling the trapped pony. His worry was palpable. He nuzzled the smaller horse, then turned to Jessica, almost as if urging her to hurry. Jessica's hands shook as she approached, but her voice was steady. "Easy, sweetheart. I've got you." She reached for the wire, carefully untwisting it, wincing as it bit her palms. The pony shied away at first, but Ranger pressed close, blocking its retreat. It was as if he was saying, "Trust her, she's here to help." Minutes passed, every second feeling stretched thin. Jessica's mind raced through possibilities. Was this pony abandoned? Wild? Was someone else out here? Still, she pushed those questions aside, focusing on the task at hand. She unwound the last loop of wire, freeing the pony's leg, and gently stroked its muddy neck. "There you go. It's over now," she whispered, fighting the sting of tears. The pony sagged in relief, sides trembling. A Ranger nickered softly, lowering his head to nuzzle his friend. Jessica watched the exchange, something warm and old stirring inside her. A memory of her father comforting their horses after a thunderstorm. Gentle hands and softer words than he ever gave to people. Jessica checked the wound. Bad, but not fatal if cleaned soon. She took off her jacket, wrapping it gently around the pony's shoulders to keep it warm. Only now did she notice neither horse wore a halter, except for Ranger, whose leather halter glinted dully in the flashlight's glow. She brushed mud from the metal plate, squinting. "Ranger C. Dawson, U.S. Cavalry." Jessica's brow furrowed. C. Dawson, U.S. Cavalry. She ran her fingers over the letters. Ranger watched her, as if waiting for recognition. The name tugged at something in her memory. Old stories maybe, or a headline glimpsed years ago. A missing soldier, a veteran? Questions spun in her mind. What had these horses survived? Who was C. Dawson, and why were they out here alone, injured and afraid? Thunder rumbled far off, as if in answer. Jessica glanced upward. Rain would be here soon. She had to get both horses to safety. She coaxed the pony. Dusty, she decided. The name a gentle fit for his small, scrappy frame. To his feet. He limped, but managed to follow, pressed close to Ranger's side. The bond between the two was unmistakable. Dusty looked to Ranger for comfort, and Ranger responded with every ounce of steady, patient strength. As they moved slowly back toward the road, Jessica kept a hand on Dusty's neck, murmuring reassurances. She could feel the tension leaking out of the pony with every step, but the night around them seemed to thicken, pressing close. Jessica felt eyes on her. Maybe her own nerves. Maybe the silent watchfulness of the ancient trees. Or maybe someone else. She shook off the thought, focusing instead on getting her small, makeshift herd to her truck. Once there, she loaded Dusty into the back, making a bed of her emergency blankets and hay. Ranger hesitated at the tailgate, looking back into the woods before finally climbing in, never letting Dusty out of his sight. Jessica slammed the door and stood for a long moment, rain beginning to drum on the roof. She let herself feel the adrenaline, the fear, and the strange, fierce hope that had flared in her chest. These horses had found her for a reason. She couldn't shake the sense that she was part of something bigger, a story already in motion, driven by the haunted eyes of a horse who refused to give up. As she started the engine and turned back toward the ranger station, Jessica cast one last look into the redwoods. For a moment, she thought she saw a shadow moving among the trees, a shape too tall to be a deer, too quick for a bear. Her pulse skipped. The mystery was only deepening. But tonight, she'd saved 2 lives. And maybe, in some small way, she'd started to save herself. Rain hammered the metal roof of the ranger station as Jessica steered her truck beneath the old floodlight. The lot was empty, silent but for the downpour and the occasional far-off crack of thunder. She'd phoned animal control on the drive, but at this hour, nearly 2 in the morning, it would be hours before anyone arrived. For now, it was just her, the 2 horses, and the storm. Jessica eased open the door and let the scent of wet earth and horse sweat roll over her. Dusty, shivering beneath the emergency blanket, lay curled against a bale of hay. Ranger stood beside him, head lowered, his massive body tense and vigilant. The big horse barely acknowledged Jessica as she entered, save for a sideways flick of one ear, a gesture that was both a greeting and a warning. He was here for Dusty, and nothing would pry him away. She knelt beside the pony, flashlight balanced on a feed bucket. Rain slashed sideways through the open barn door, blurring the world beyond into streaks of silver and shadow. Jessica's hands moved quickly and carefully. She cleaned Dusty's leg, picking bits of wire from the wound, wincing each time the pony flinched. She murmured to him in a low voice, the way her father once had, using words she hadn't spoken in years. "Easy. You're safe now. I promise you're safe." Dusty blinked, eyelids fluttering, and let out a shaky breath. Jessica dabbed the last of the blood away, then wrapped the wound with a clean gauze pad from her kit. As she worked, Ranger hovered just behind her. She could feel his warm breath against her back, the weight of his presence like a silent oath. Done. Jessica slumped against the wall, her hair sticking to her forehead. Exhaustion clawed at her, but something else kept her awake. A restless, watchful energy in the air. She glanced at Ranger, who had resumed his post beside Dusty. The big horse was restless, pawing at the straw, tail swishing, eyes darting to the open door whenever the wind howled louder. She dug in her pocket and produced a carrot, holding it out. Ranger eyed her warily, but after a moment, he stretched his neck forward and accepted the offering, lips brushing her palm. Jessica smiled, a small warmth blooming inside her. "You're a good boy," she whispered, not expecting a response. He chewed, but made no move to leave Dusty's side. Jessica watched them, the battered pony, the scarred guardian, and felt something uncoil within her. She saw, in their silent loyalty, a reflection of her own life. The years of keeping watch over her wounded father. The late nights listening for the sound of the front door, hoping he'd return from wherever his mind wandered. The quiet promise that, no matter what, she would never leave him behind. Thunder rumbled again. The barn lights flickered. Jessica stood and walked to the door, staring out at the rain-blurred trees. Somewhere out there, she knew, were answers about these horses, about C. Dawson, about the pain that haunted Ranger's eyes. For now, all she had was a fragment, the name on Ranger's halter, and a gut feeling that this was more than just a rescue. She returned to Dusty, gently running her fingers through the pony's tangled mane. Something rough caught her skin. Curious, she parted the hair and found, knotted deep in the strands, a ragged bit of wool. Jessica held it up to the light. An old, faded scrap, dirty but still recognizable, a piece of a U.S. cavalry saddle blanket, the initials CD barely visible along one edge. Her breath caught. The name again. C. Dawson. She glanced from the scrap to Ranger, whose ears pricked forward, eyes intent. He was watching her every move, as if waiting for her to understand. A memory surfaced. Her father spinning tales about cavalrymen and their loyal mounts. The bond between soldier and horse. Jessica closed her fist around the cloth, a silent vow forming in her heart. "I'll find out what happened," she promised softly, her voice almost lost in the storm. She made up 2 stalls as best she could with what little she had. Fresh straw, old blankets, a bucket of clean water. Dusty limped inside, immediately pressing up against Ranger. The big horse stood guard, unmoving, his eyes never leaving the smaller animal. Jessica watched them settle in, the weight of the night pressing on her shoulders. Despite the exhaustion, she couldn't bring herself to leave. She sat on an overturned feed tub, listening to the rain. Her mind spun with questions about the horses, about the strange appearance in the woods, about the ragged bit of cavalry blanket. She wondered if she'd ever get answers, or if this night would remain just another unsolved mystery buried in the redwoods. Time passed. The storm raged. Jessica felt herself drifting, half asleep. Memories came in flickers, her father's laugh, the warmth of a horse's flank beneath her hand, the steady rhythm of hooves on soft earth. She remembered feeling safe once. She remembered believing that, if she waited long enough, everything broken would eventually heal. A loud clang snapped her awake. She bolted upright. Ranger had kicked the stall door, eyes wild and head high. Jessica hurried over, heart in her throat, but he only snorted, nostrils flaring, then turned his head toward Dusty, as if checking on him before finally settling down. Jessica let out a shaky breath, her own nerves jangling. She closed the barn doors, locking them tight against the storm. Inside, she checked the horses one last time, then found herself unable to leave. So she stayed, curled in an old chair, listening to the storm, the steady breathing of Ranger and Dusty, and the quiet thrum of her own heart. She wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring: animal control, questions, maybe even trouble for breaking protocol. But she knew one thing: she wouldn't give up on these horses. Not after what they'd been through. Not after what she'd seen in Ranger's eyes. Somewhere outside, the rain began to ease, the storm passing on toward the ocean. Jessica closed her eyes, one hand still clutching the scrap of cavalry blanket. She made a silent promise, to the horses, to herself, to the memory of her father, that she would see this through, whatever it took. The following week settled over Jessica's life with the weight of old habits and new uncertainties. Rain came and went, dappling the redwoods and soaking the earth around her small home at the edge of Humboldt Redwoods State Park. Each morning, pale sunlight broke through mist-laced branches, glinting off wet ferns and the makeshift paddock she'd built out of old fencing and borrowed lumber. There, Ranger and Dusty found a temporary sanctuary, a far cry from the wild, haunted night they'd endured, but not yet home. Dusty's recovery was slow but steady. Every dawn, Jessica would rise early, tug on her boots and step into the dew-drenched world outside. She'd find Dusty standing close to Ranger, the pony's wound healing beneath fresh bandages, his eyes gradually losing their terrified glaze. At first, Dusty shied from every movement, flinched at the brush of her hand. But time, care, and Ranger's constant presence worked a quiet magic. Jessica watched as the two horses grazed together, nuzzled shoulder to shoulder, a silent reminder that the world, even in its wildest moments, could still offer comfort. Jessica's home, small and spare, filled with the earthy scent of hay and horses. She cleaned the stalls twice a day, boiled buckets of water to wash Dusty's wounds, and spoke softly as she worked. In the evenings, when fog rolled in off the river and the woods grew silent, she would settle into an old armchair with her leather-bound journal and write by the flickering light of a lantern. October 19th. Dusty let me touch his nose today. Ranger never leaves his side. I can't shake the feeling they've both lost more than I know. There's a story in Ranger's eyes. Something old, wounded, but unbreakable. Those quiet nights brought memories she thought she'd buried for good. She remembered her father's strong hands, the way he brushed their old gelding after long shifts at the mill, the silence that followed him through the house like a shadow. She remembered feeling helpless as a child, unsure how to bridge the gap between what he'd lost in Vietnam and what he could never say. With Ranger and Dusty in her care, Jessica felt that ache resurface, a familiar loneliness, but also a faint flicker of hope. Sometimes she'd find herself whispering into the fog while feeding the horses at dusk. "You're still waiting for him, aren't you?" she'd ask Ranger, her voice soft enough to get lost in the chill air. Ranger would flick an ear, his eyes fixed on the tree line, as if searching for someone only he could see. The pattern became ritual. During the day, Jessica played caretaker and detective, calling local stables, leaving messages for the few remaining cavalry reenactors in Northern California, even posting a photo of Ranger's halter online. Nobody responded. No one had seen a man named C. Dawson, or knew of horses matching their descriptions. The world, as ever, was full of unanswered questions, but at night, in those fragile hours when exhaustion blurred the edges of her thoughts, Jessica felt something shifting inside her. She wrote in her journal, "I know what it is to wait for someone who never comes home. Maybe that's why I can't give up on them. Ranger watches the woods every dusk. I see myself in him, always listening, always hoping. How do you heal a wound you can't see?" Ranger, ever the sentinel, became a living metaphor for her own fears. Each evening, as the sky bruised purple and blue, he'd pace the edge of the paddock, nostrils flaring, eyes locked on the shadowed forest. Dusty, content now to nibble grass at his side, sometimes watched him with a kind of trust Jessica envied. Even when she sat beside them, sketching their silhouettes or simply breathing in their presence, Jessica felt like an outsider, a guest at her own table. Her neighbors and co-workers began to notice the change. Jessica, once known for her cool distance and strict adherence to rules, was now softer around the edges, slower to anger, quicker to smile. She brought Dusty and Ranger apples from the local orchard, let children from the park's nature club visit, and learn to brush a horse's mane. Still, she kept the mystery close, unwilling to share more than she had to. One night, after a particularly long day of fielding calls and tending to the horses, Jessica stood in the paddock and looked up at the stars winking through shifting fog. Ranger stood beside her, breathing slow and deep, while Dusty dozed near the fence. "You know," she murmured, her breath clouding, "I think you're teaching me how to be brave again. Not the kind of brave that makes headlines. The quiet kind. The kind that just shows up and stays, even when it hurts." Ranger's ear twitched. Somewhere in the woods, an owl called, and the wind rustled through the ferns. Jessica felt a strange, fragile peace settle over her. She wasn't sure where this path would lead, whether it ended in answers or only more questions, but for the first time in years, she didn't feel so alone. As the week wore on, the days grew colder. Every dusk, without fail, Ranger resumed his watchful post, staring into the forest, nostrils wide, listening for something Jessica couldn't hear. That tension, unresolved, almost sacred, hung between them, a thread of longing that tied past and present together. She ended each night with her journal open, words tumbling out into the quiet. "Sometimes I think Ranger is waiting for a ghost. Sometimes I think I am, too. Maybe that's why we found each other." Jessica closed her eyes, listening to the horse's slow breathing, the steady thump of Dusty's tail against the fence. Beyond the paddock, the woods held their secrets. But for now, here in the fog and starlight, she found comfort in the rhythm of healing, a family of three, waiting for whatever the night might bring. The cold mist clung to Jessica's skin as she stepped into the yard just before sunrise, drawn by a sense of unease she couldn't shake. Her breath fogged the air as she headed to the paddock, rubbing sleep from her eyes. Ranger was already waiting at the gate, his powerful body tense, ears pricked forward. His dark mane rippled as he stamped the ground, almost vibrating with urgency. Jessica frowned, watching the big horse shift his weight, his focus locked on the shadowy woods beyond the fence. Dusty lingered close by, eyes wide but trusting, ready to follow wherever Ranger led. For days, Ranger had watched the trees at dusk and dawn, but this morning his energy was different. Restless, insistent. "All right, big guy," Jessica muttered, reaching for her flashlight and slipping on her boots. "Show me what's got you so worked up." She opened the gate, and Ranger stepped out, pausing to nuzzle Dusty as if reassuring him. Jessica followed, her nerves buzzing. The sun was a faint smear behind a wall of fog, turning the world gray and indistinct. Branches dripped water onto her shoulders, the chill of wet earth soaked through her jeans as she hurried to keep pace with the horse. Ranger moved with purpose, head low, nostrils flaring as he sniffed the ground. He led Jessica off the familiar trails and deeper into the ancient heart of the redwoods, where the trees grew impossibly tall and the undergrowth thickened with every step. She stumbled more than once over slick roots and tangled ferns, but Ranger pressed on, stopping only to make sure she was keeping up. The world grew still as they left the sound of the road behind. Jessica's heart thudded louder, anxiety curling in her gut. She kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something watching from the gloom. Every distant crack of a branch sent her pulse racing. After what felt like forever, the woods opened onto a small, hidden clearing. Jessica hesitated, catching her breath as she took in the scene before her. A weathered cabin hunched beneath the redwoods, almost swallowed by brambles and moss. The roof sagged, shingles gone to rot. Horseshoes, their metal rusted and pitted, hung over the door in a faded arc. Tattered blue and gold fabric, a cavalry pennant maybe, dangled from a broken beam. The whole place smelled of old secrets and abandoned hopes. Ranger walked straight to the porch and pawed at the planks, snorting. Jessica climbed up after him, her boots sinking into soft, spongy wood. She pressed her palm to the door. It swung open with a low groan, revealing a single room bathed in the pale light of morning. Inside, dust motes danced in the air. Saddles, blankets, and bits of gear were strewn haphazardly across the floor. A cracked mirror reflected her startled face. On a battered table, a notebook lay open, pages warped from damp, the handwriting inside jagged and frantic. Jessica picked it up, her hands trembling as she read, "Can't trust anyone. Someone's watching. If I disappear, find Ranger. Protect Dusty. Don't go to the police. Trust no one." Her breath caught. Each line was more desperate than the last. Some scrawled in the margins, others crossed out and rewritten. It felt less like a journal and more like a plea for help. Beneath one passage, a faded photo was taped. A young man in cavalry dress uniform, arms around Ranger and Dusty, both horses looking proud and strong. His smile was broad, but his eyes seemed tired, wary. Jessica swallowed hard, tracing the name written on the back. Chris Dawson, Ranger, Dusty, my family, no matter what. A cold shiver ran through her. She remembered the initials CD on Dusty's saddle scrap and Ranger's halter. So this was their missing owner, Chris Dawson. But what had happened to him? Why had he left his horses alone in the woods? And who was he afraid of? Ranger whinnied suddenly, loud and sharp, startling Jessica from her thoughts. He nosed through a pile of gear, digging out a folded army blanket and tossing it aside. Jessica crouched, searching the floor. Among the scattered belongings, she found more clues. A battered flashlight, half a dozen maps marked with red X's, an old dog tag stamped Dawson C. The air in the cabin felt heavy, charged with memories and warnings. Jessica moved to the window, peering out at the empty clearing. The fog had begun to lift, revealing a tangle of hoofprints in the soft earth outside. Some were fresh, too fresh maybe to belong only to Ranger or Dusty. Her skin prickled with unease. She turned back to the table and thumbed through the notebook, looking for answers. The last entry was smeared and almost illegible. "They're close. If I don't make it, forgive me. Tell my horses I'm sorry. Ranger knows the way home." For a moment, Jessica just stood there, feeling the weight of grief and guilt pressed into every word. She looked at Ranger, who met her gaze with deep, mournful eyes. It was as if he understood every page, every secret. Dusty lingered by the door, ears twitching. Jessica stuffed the photo and notebook into her jacket, her mind swirling. Chris Dawson was out here. Maybe still alive, maybe still in danger. And someone, or something, had driven him to hide in the wilderness. She pressed her hand to Ranger's neck, drawing courage from his steady presence. Outside, a branch snapped. Too close for comfort. Jessica froze, pulse leaping. She scanned the clearing. Nothing moved but the wind in the trees. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching, hidden, just out of sight. Ranger pressed his head against her shoulder, and Jessica whispered, "We'll find him, I promise." With Dusty close at their heels, she led the horses out of the cabin and back into the shelter of the trees. The redwoods closed behind them, their shadows long and deep, as the mystery of Chris Dawson and the danger lurking in the woods grew larger with every step. The path back to Jessica's home felt longer, the forest heavier, weighed down with secrets and suspicion. Every step, every creak of branch and whisper of wind set her nerves on edge. Ranger moved beside her, his body tight, ears flicking in every direction. Dusty stayed close, as if sensing the current of unease that now ran beneath their world. When they finally reached the edge of her property, the sun was already burning off the last of the morning fog. Jessica hurried the horses into the paddock, double-checking every latch, every gate. Something in her gut told her that whoever or whatever was out there in the redwoods had noticed her search. She could still feel eyes on her, watching from somewhere deep within the trees. Jessica spent the next hour scanning the woods with her binoculars, her mind replaying the words in Chris Dawson's notebook. "Don't trust anyone. Someone's watching. If I disappear..." The fear was contagious. She found herself jumping at shadows, heart pounding at every unexpected sound. Later that afternoon, a storm gathered overhead, dark clouds rolling in from the west. Thunder rumbled through the redwoods, low and distant. Jessica stood on her porch, staring at the tree line. It was then that she noticed something strange. A faint, narrow trail of hoofprints in the wet grass, leading away from her paddock and back toward the thickest part of the forest. She swallowed hard. Dusty and Ranger were restless, circling the paddock, snorting and calling out. Their energy set her teeth on edge. She couldn't sit still. Jessica grabbed her raincoat, tucked Chris Dawson's notebook into her backpack, and slipped a small flashlight into her pocket. She looked at Ranger and whispered, "Let's find him." The forest swallowed them once again, this time darker and more sinister beneath the looming storm. Ranger led the way, his stride long and purposeful, his nose low to the ground. Jessica moved quietly behind him, heart hammering with anticipation and fear. They walked for what felt like hours, winding through ferns and ancient trees, the light fading to a dim, haunted gray. When they reached the clearing near the abandoned cabin, Jessica stopped dead in her tracks. The ground was churned with fresh hoofprints and something else. Boot prints, deep and erratic, circling the paddock behind the old structure. Jessica's breath caught. Someone had been here. Recently. Ranger's ears pinned back, his body rigid as he let out a high, piercing whinny that echoed through the clearing. Dusty shrank close to Jessica's side, trembling. A sudden crack of thunder overhead made the world shudder. From behind the cabin, a figure lurched into view. A man, gaunt and wild-eyed, with a thick beard and filthy hands. He wore a torn cavalry jacket over a tattered t-shirt, dog tags glinting at his neck. Mud streaked his face, and his eyes darted between Jessica and the horses with the panic of a trapped animal. Jessica's first instinct was to step back. She reached for her phone, only to realize she'd left it in the house. Her mind raced. Should she run? Should she confront him? Ranger made the decision for her. With a guttural cry, the big horse surged forward, barreling straight at the man. Jessica gasped, but instead of fleeing, the man dropped to his knees in the mud, arms wide, tears streaking his dirty cheeks. "Ranger! Oh, God! Ranger!" The horse skidded to a stop in front of him, breathing hard, his entire body quivering with recognition and relief. The man threw his arms around Ranger's neck, sobbing. Dusty, emboldened by Ranger's joy, pranced up beside them and pressed his nose to the man's shoulder. Jessica's fear faded, replaced by a shock of understanding. She watched as the man clung to the horses, repeating their names in a hoarse, desperate voice. The truth tumbled into place. Chris Dawson, alive but a shell of the proud young man in the photograph. After several minutes, Chris pulled back, wiping his face with the back of his hand. His gaze finally settled on Jessica, wary but grateful. You found them," he rasped, voice broken from disuse. Jessica nodded, keeping her movements calm, non-threatening. "Are you Chris Dawson? I found your horses. I've been caring for them." Chris nodded, still clutching Ranger's mane like a lifeline. I thought I lost them. I thought I lost everything." Jessica knelt, careful not to startle him. "You're safe now. Both of them are safe. I found your notebook, your cabin. I know you're scared, but you're not alone anymore." For a long moment, Chris just stared at her, shivering. Then, in a flood, the words came tumbling out, disjointed, frantic but honest. "I couldn't trust anyone. They kept following me, watching. After the army, after I came home. Nothing felt real. I couldn't sleep. I thought, if I left, maybe they'd be safe at least. I didn't want anyone else hurt because of me." Ranger whickered softly, pressing his nose to Chris's hand. Jessica's heart ached. She recognized the shape of trauma, the desperate calculus of a mind frayed by fear and guilt. "You did your best," she said, her voice gentle. "You kept them alive. That's something. You're not alone anymore, Chris. You have them. And now you have me." The rain began to fall in earnest, soaking them all to the skin. Chris hunched his shoulders, but he didn't run. Instead, he leaned into Ranger's strength, letting himself be held by the animals who had never judged or abandoned him. Jessica rose to her feet, offering a hand. "Let's get out of the rain. You can rest at my place. We'll figure out what to do together." Chris hesitated, fear still shadowing his features, but the trust in Ranger's eyes finally drew him to his feet. With one arm around Dusty and the other clutching Ranger, he followed Jessica through the trees, back toward light, shelter, and, for the first time in a long time, hope. As they left the clearing behind, Jessica looked over her shoulder. The forest was still watching. The past would not let go so easily. But tonight, for the first time, she wasn't afraid to face it. The rain had finally softened to a steady drizzle by the time Jessica, Chris, Ranger, and Dusty returned to the modest cabin that Jessica called home. It was cramped, with peeling paint and windows fogged by years of Humboldt mist. But tonight it pulsed with a rare sense of belonging, a fragile sanctuary lit by the golden glow of a single lamp. Ranger and Dusty, their coats still damp and flecked with leaves, settled quickly in the makeshift paddock outside, while Jessica brewed coffee and set out a spare blanket for Chris. He sat at her kitchen table, shoulders hunched, hands wrapped around the steaming mug she'd placed in front of him. His eyes, startlingly blue beneath tangled hair, flitted constantly to the window, searching for threats Jessica couldn't see. Silence hung heavy in the room, broken only by the low whicker of horses and the gentle clink of spoon against ceramic. Jessica took a seat across from him. She could feel the old, familiar wariness in her chest, the need to fill the air with something gentle. "You're safe here," she said softly. "No one's going to take them away. No one's going to hurt you." Chris managed a nod, but she could see his hands shaking. "You don't understand. The world doesn't let you go. Once it's got its claws in you, you're marked." He looked down, voice breaking. "I never meant to leave them. I thought if I ran, maybe they'd be left alone, you know? But Ranger, he found you. He always finds people who need him." Jessica glanced out the window, watching as Ranger stood sentinel beside Dusty, the two horses pressed close together. "He found me too," she admitted. "I don't think I realized how much I needed saving until I met them." Chris smiled, just a flicker. He's always been like that. In Afghanistan, he'd stand between me and anything. Gunfire, bombs, didn't matter. He was fearless. I was the one falling apart, not him. Jessica hesitated, then reached for her old journal, flipping it open to a blank page. "Sometimes the strongest ones are the ones carrying everyone else's burdens. That's what my dad used to say." Chris's gaze sharpened. "Was he military?" Jessica nodded. "Vietnam, came back different. Never talked about what happened. But he carried it everywhere. I grew up listening for footsteps, for silence, for the moods that swept through the house. Sometimes I thought if I was just good enough, quiet enough, I could keep him from drifting too far away. But I never could." Chris looked down at his hands. "That's how it feels with Ranger, with Dusty. I wanted to be the hero, the one who brought everyone home, but I just got lost. Couldn't trust anybody, not even myself." Outside, a break in the clouds let moonlight spill over the redwoods, silvering the horses' backs. Ranger lifted his head, looking straight at the window, as if sensing the conversation inside. Jessica wrote in her journal for a moment, the scratch of pen on paper soothing. "I think we all get lost. The trick is finding someone who doesn't let you disappear." Chris closed his eyes, breath shaky. "You don't know what it's like. Nightmares, always feeling hunted. Every sound in the woods, every shadow. Sometimes I'd hear Rangers whinny and think I was back over there, that everything was about to explode. I thought I could outrun it. But the only ones who stayed were the horses. They never let me down." Jessica listened in silence, her own heart pounding with recognition. "I get it," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "It's not the kind of pain that shows up in x-rays, but it's real, and it's heavy. You don't have to carry it alone anymore." A tear slid down Chris's cheek. He quickly wiped it away, embarrassment flickering across his face. "You're the first person I've told all this. Everybody else just wants me to get better, move on, like it's that simple." Jessica offered a wry smile. "Sometimes I wish it was. But maybe it starts with talking, with letting someone in." She hesitated, then placed her hand gently over his. "I won't tell anyone where you are. Not unless you want me to." But maybe we can find a way through this together. You, me, Ranger, Dusty. None of us is good alone. The front door creaked as a gust of wind rattled the house. Ranger whinnied, a deep rumbling sound that seemed to fill the space with a sense of security. Chris let out a shaky laugh. He always knows when I need him. Jessica chuckled. He's got good instincts. She thought for a moment, then added, if you ever want to talk to someone who knows about this stuff, who won't judge, I could help you find them. There are programs, people who work with veterans, with animals. I know some folks at the park who run therapy sessions with horses. Maybe it would help. Chris considered this, fingers tracing the rim of his mug. Maybe. If Ranger and Dusty could come, I'd try. They sat in companionable silence, listening to the rain and the distant calls of nightbirds. The storm had passed, leaving the world washed and quiet. Jessica glanced at Chris, exhausted, but less alone than before. Outside, Ranger pressed his broad head against the fence, watching over the cabin with the same silent loyalty that had saved Chris's life more than once. Dusty dozed in the moonlight, finally at peace. Jessica closed her journal, feeling something loosen in her chest. The pain hadn't vanished, but it felt lighter, shared. For the first time in years, she believed in the possibility of healing. Not just for the man across the table, but for herself as well. As the clock struck midnight, Chris slumped over the table, sleep overtaking him. Jessica fetched another blanket and gently draped it around his shoulders. Rest, she murmured. We'll face tomorrow together. The cabin, battered by storms and haunted by memories, held them all, man, woman, and horses, bound by the quiet, unbreakable thread of survival and love. The morning after Chris's first real sleep in weeks dawned unusually bright. Sunlight filtered through the redwoods, painting golden bars across Jessica's kitchen floor. For a fleeting moment, the world outside her window seemed ordinary. Birds chattered, coffee steamed on the table, and the two horses grazed quietly in the paddock. But beneath the calm, Jessica sensed a change coming. The storm had broken something open, and now the wider world was stirring. Word traveled fast in a small town. By midday, animal control officers rolled up Jessica's driveway, their white truck crunching on gravel. Behind them, a van from the local Veterans Outreach Center idled. The officers stepped out, one young, one older, both wary but not unfriendly. Jessica saw them clock Ranger and Dusty, then Chris, who hovered just inside the porch, his shoulders tense. Miss Nolan, we got some calls about two horses. Looks like one might be cavalry trained, said the senior officer, clipboard in hand. And your message said there's a missing veteran involved? Jessica nodded, keeping her voice calm. That's right. This is Chris Dawson. He's not a danger to anyone. He's been through a lot, but he's safe here. The horses are his, and they saved each other's lives. I think they saved mine, too. Chris glanced at her, panic flickering in his eyes. He clung to Ranger's halter, Dusty pressed close to his hip. They're not taking them, are they? Please don't let them. Jessica stepped between him and the officers, voice steady but fierce. You're not taking anyone anywhere. Chris needs help, not handcuffs. He's a veteran who's been through hell, and those horses are the only family he has left. The younger officer hesitated, looking from Jessica to the horses and back again. The older officer softened a little, lowering his clipboard. We're not here to hurt anybody, Miss Nolan, but we need to make sure everyone's safe. Maybe Chris can tell us what happened. Chris trembled, Words tangled on his tongue. Jessica gently squeezed his arm. "It's okay," she whispered. "Tell them the truth. I'm right here." He drew a ragged breath. "I was with the cavalry unit overseas. When I came home, nothing felt right. Everybody was gone. Ranger and Dusty were all I had. But after a while, I started thinking someone was after me. I hid in the woods. I just wanted to keep them safe. I'm sorry for causing trouble. I didn't know who to trust." The veterans outreach worker, a woman named Marlene, stepped forward, her voice warm and calm. "Chris, you don't have to run anymore. We have a program here, equestrian therapy for veterans. You can bring Ranger and Dusty. No one's going to take them away. Would you be willing to talk to some of our counselors? Maybe share your story with others who understand?" Jessica watched Chris's fear loosen, bit by bit, replaced by the smallest spark of hope. He glanced at her for reassurance. "They could come with me?" "Of course," Marlene promised. "In fact, we'd love it if they did. Ranger and Dusty could help a lot of folks. Horses have a way of seeing right through to your heart, don't they?" A murmur of agreement passed through the group. Jessica felt the tension in her shoulders ease, replaced by gratitude and pride. It wasn't over. Healing never happened overnight. But this was the first time in years she'd seen a door open for someone who truly needed it. Word about the rescue and the extraordinary loyalty of Ranger and Dusty spread fast. The following week, the local news station sent a reporter to Jessica's place. Neighbors gathered, whispering with awe as Ranger nudged Chris's shoulder and Dusty allowed children to pet his now healed leg. Even the park superintendent arrived, officially recognizing Jessica's courage and the horse's role in bringing Chris home. A makeshift ceremony took place under the redwoods, with the whole town turning out. Volunteers, veterans, children from the park's nature club, and the local sheriff who wiped his eyes when he thought no one was watching. Ranger stood tall beside Chris. Dusty nestled close, both of them garlanded with wildflowers. When the time came for speeches, Chris tried to decline, shuffling his feet and staring at the grass. But Marlene encouraged him, her hand gentle on his shoulder. Jessica whispered, "You don't have to be perfect. Just tell the truth. That's enough." Chris cleared his throat, his voice wavering but strong enough to reach the first row. "I didn't think I'd make it back. I didn't think any of us would. Ranger and Dusty," he stopped, overcome by emotion, as Ranger pressed his head into Chris's chest. "They never gave up on me. When everyone else disappeared, they stayed. That's what saved me. They're the real heroes." The crowd, dozens of people, many who'd once served themselves, stood in silence, moved in a way words could barely capture. Jessica caught her breath, blinking back tears. The town that had so often seemed distant or divided was, in this moment, united by something rare and precious: empathy, recognition, hope. When the ceremony ended, Jessica watched as children led Dusty to the paddock, and townsfolk took turns feeding Ranger handfuls of carrots and apples. Chris, still dazed by the outpouring of kindness, leaned against the fence and let the sun warm his face. Later, as the afternoon light faded and the crowd drifted away, Marlene approached Jessica, her expression thoughtful. "I've seen a lot of rescues, Jessica, but never anything like this. Would you consider working with us, helping more veterans and horses? What you did, it changes people." Jessica smiled, feeling something new settle in her heart, a sense of purpose. "I'd like that. I think Ranger and Dusty would too." As dusk crept through the redwoods, Jessica stood beside Chris and their horses, wrapped in the simple magic of community and second chances. She understood, perhaps for the first time, that healing was never meant to be solitary work. The world was full of wounds, but also full of hands, human and hoof alike, reaching to mend them. And as Ranger looked into her eyes, Jessica knew they were exactly where they were meant to be. The story of Ranger, Dusty, and Chris became the quiet talk of the town for weeks afterward. It was there in the morning paper, in conversations over coffee at the diner, and in the laughter of children who now visited Jessica's home just to see the horses up close. Yet for Jessica, the real heart of the story unfolded quietly, far from the spotlight, in the gentle rhythm of her days and the silent transformations happening inside her. Evenings became her favorite time. After long days helping Chris adjust to life beyond hiding and working with the new therapy program, she'd slip out to the backyard with a mug of tea, Ranger by her side. Together they watched Dusty graze in the fading light, the pony's coat sleek and healthy again, the old wound now just a pale scar on his leg. The air held the chill of autumn, the scent of wood smoke drifting in from a neighbor's fireplace. These moments felt sacred, a hush that allowed the noise and chaos of the world to melt away. Jessica stroked Ranger's mane, her fingers combing through the thick hair with quiet reverence. In those calm twilight hours, she let herself reflect, replaying the wild, uncertain days that had led them all here. The foggy midnight meeting, the tense rescue in the woods, the fear and hope tangled together as they'd found Chris and brought him home. She thought of all the moments she'd doubted herself, the split-second decision to trust her instincts rather than the rulebook, the risk of following a haunted horse into the unknown. For most of her life, Jessica had believed that following the rules would keep her safe. She'd built careful boundaries, telling herself she was protecting her heart, her reputation, her career. But it was compassion, messy, risky, deeply human compassion, that had made the difference. That had saved 2 horses, a man, and quietly, herself. She leaned against Ranger's massive shoulder. "You know you were the bravest one," she murmured, voice barely louder than the whispering breeze. "You didn't give up. Not on Dusty, not on Chris, not even on me." Ranger flicked his ears, eyes warm and watchful. He seemed to understand, always had, a steady, grounding presence through every twist and heartbreak. Jessica marveled at how a creature so silent could teach her so much about loyalty and hope. Dusty, too, had changed. Once a panicked, bleating stray, the pony now welcomed visitors with a nudge and a soft snort, letting children braid his mane or feed him carrots. He'd become a star at the new equine center, his gentle nature drawing out smiles from even the shyest kids. Parents whispered about the miracle horses and asked Jessica for advice about animals, about healing, about resilience. But it was Chris whose transformation struck Jessica most. He was still a quiet man, shadows sometimes drifting across his features. But he was present. Each morning, he'd arrive early to help with chores, hauling hay, brushing the horses, mending fences. Sometimes he'd pause, gazing at the sunrise or the mist curling over the fields, and Jessica would sense a weight lifting from his shoulders. With Ranger beside him, Chris began to participate in the veterans' therapy sessions. At first, he hung back, wary of the group's laughter and confessions. But week by week, he opened up, sharing stories of patrols overseas, of the comfort he'd found in Ranger's steady strength, of the guilt and confusion that had haunted his return home. The other veterans, seeing the bond between man and horse, found words for their own pain. Ranger became an unofficial mascot for the program. His photograph hung on the therapy barn's wall, a symbol of survival and second chances. Jessica watched all this with quiet awe. She realized that the real rescue hadn't been just about surviving that night in the woods, but about opening doors for others, to speak, to trust, to hope again. The community, too, had changed. Neighbors brought food for the horses and volunteered at the center. Children drew pictures of Ranger and Dusty and tacked them to Jessica's front door. Even those who'd once kept their distance, judging Chris for his disappearances, whispering about Jessica's solitary ways, now greeted her with warmth, grateful for the new light the horses had brought into their lives. One crisp evening, as the sun dipped behind the redwoods and the world blushed gold, Jessica sat in the grass with her journal, Ranger resting his chin on her shoulder. She wrote, letting the truth spill out onto the page. I used to think courage meant holding everything together alone. But real courage is reaching out when you're scared, letting others help, and believing that connection, not control, is what saves us. Ranger was never just a lost horse. He was the bridge between brokenness and hope, between what I was afraid to lose and what I never thought I'd find. In saving him and Dusty, I learned how to save myself, and maybe help others do the same. She closed her journal and looked up at the sky, where the first stars shimmered through the fading light. Inside the house, Chris's laughter drifted through the window as he helped a new group of veterans settle in. Dusty whinnied softly, content. The park's director had even hinted at expanding the program. More horses, more people, more healing. Jessica knew there would always be hard days. Grief and memory never left for long. But the thread of hope running through her life was stronger than ever before. She was ready for whatever came next. As night fell, Jessica whispered a silent thank you to Ranger, to Dusty, to Chris, and to every second chance she'd been brave enough to accept. And out in the darkness, it seemed, the redwoods stood a little taller, guardians of a new beginning, witnesses to the miracles that compassion and courage could bring. Months passed, and the memory of that desperate fog-choked night in the redwoods became something else, a cornerstone of transformation, a story the whole community shared. For Jessica, Chris, Ranger, and Dusty, the events that had first brought them together became not just a memory, but a foundation for lasting change. Chris attended therapy with other veterans now, a routine he once would have scorned or fled. Ranger was always there, the unofficial greeter at the barn, his brown head turning to watch every new arrival. Sometimes when Chris faltered or his hands shook at the threshold, Ranger would simply lean against him, solid as the trees themselves, reminding him that the present moment was safe. The day Chris volunteered to speak at the Veterans Equine Therapy Program, Jessica watched with tears in her eyes. He stood tall, telling his story, not as a cautionary tale, but as a beacon for those still struggling in silence. There was a time, he told the group gathered beneath a canopy of redwood branches, when I thought I was beyond saving. I didn't know how to ask for help. I didn't trust people, and I didn't trust myself. But this horse, this animal refused to leave me behind. And because of Ranger, I found my way back. He paused, one hand on Ranger's neck, the other reaching out to the next veteran waiting for hope. If you're here tonight, maybe you feel broken. Maybe you don't even know why you came. But trust me, sometimes healing rides in on 4 hooves and a gentle nudge. Don't turn away from it. Reach back. The crowd listened in stillness, many faces streaked with quiet tears. Jessica, standing off to the side, felt a profound sense of gratitude. Her own life had changed too. Once defined by solitude and strict boundaries, Jessica was now at the heart of a growing community effort, leading workshops, advocating for animal-assisted therapy, and forging connections she'd long thought impossible. Her circle widened. She even found herself reconnecting with her own family, picking up old threads frayed by years of misunderstanding and grief. Dusty, meanwhile, became a beloved figure at the local equine center for children. Once a trembling, wounded stray, he now greeted busloads of kids each week, his gentle nature soothing even the most anxious newcomers. Parents marveled at how Dusty seemed to sense which child needed extra comfort, standing still as little hands stroked his mane, nudging the ones who were too shy to approach. Jessica watched it all unfold, her heart swelling with pride every time a child's face lit up beside the pony she'd almost lost that night in the woods. As word spread, the program grew. The redwood barn that once sheltered only Ranger and Dusty now housed more rescues, each with a story, each with wounds visible and invisible. Veterans, children, and even elders found solace and connection among the horses and the people who cared for them. The bonds between humans and animals became a lifeline, a reminder that hope often comes from the most unexpected places. One autumn evening, the town gathered for a celebration under strings of golden lights in the park. There were tables of homemade food, live music, laughter echoing through the redwoods. Ranger wore a garland of wildflowers, and Dusty had children's ribbons braided into his mane. Chris stood beside Jessica, both of them nearly overwhelmed by the outpouring of kindness. When Jessica was invited to speak, she looked out at the crowd, at faces she once barely knew, now shining with pride and recognition. She held the microphone, feeling the weight and wonder of everything she'd learned. "I want to thank you all," she began, her voice strong and steady. "Not just for helping Chris, Ranger, Dusty, and me, but for proving that real change comes from community. For seeing that the ones who are hurting most often hide it best. For believing that second chances aren't just for stories. They're for all of us. Every day." She let her gaze travel over the audience, pausing on Chris, who nodded with a gentle smile. "There was a time I thought I could handle everything alone. That being strong meant never needing anyone. But it's just not true. We all have invisible wounds. And sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is ask for help, or answer when someone else does." The crowd applauded, some wiping away tears. Jessica continued, her words now meant for everyone beyond the park, for anyone who might hear the story later. If you're listening to this and you feel lost, or you see someone else who is, don't turn away. Sometimes the smallest act of kindness is enough to start a ripple that changes a life. Ranger taught me that healing isn't just about fixing what's broken. It's about building something new together. She finished with a simple invitation, her gaze warm. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe. And remember, you can be the sign of hope someone needs. Sometimes healing rides in on 4 hooves and a gentle nudge. The evening ended with music and laughter. The community, once fractured and hesitant, now stronger, united by shared experience and newfound compassion. Jessica, Chris, Ranger, and Dusty stood at the center, surrounded by light and warmth, knowing that while their journey had begun in darkness and fear, it would go forward in hope. As Jessica led Ranger back home beneath a canopy of stars, she looked up through the branches, grateful, changed, and certain that the story would live on, wherever people believed in courage, kindness, and the healing power of connection.